Sentiment means more than you think it does. You think it's an emotion. Well, it kind of is. At least that's what Michael Langemeier from Purdue University tells us this week in the MtoM podcast. Every month, we usually report on the Purdue Barometer Index. It's actually called the AG Economy Barometer, and it comes out the first week of each month. And we usually put that into the TV show, just like we do, say, the Main Street Index or the Business Conditions Index. All three of those reports are dependent on farmer data. You pick up the phone, you answer a couple of questions, move on, and that data filters up to what you see on the show. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about, how the sausage is made at Purdue University. Michael is the director for the Center of Commercial Agriculture, and he's a professor in the Department of Agricultural Economics at Purdue University. He's a Nebraska guy, spent time in Kansas, but he's also been in Indiana for quite a while. But the difference is he doesn't always know in the surveys, well, he doesn't know where the information is coming from in terms of what their zip code is or even their state. So this is really a mix of a lot of different views on how people see the next 5 years in biofuels or trade policy or the weather. All those things factor in. We'll learn about it now here in the MtoM podcast. I'm Paul Yeager. Thank you so very much for tuning us in. A reminder, these episodes come out each and every Tuesday. You can find them in audio and video form. And if you want to send me an email about any podcast or you want to give a rating, certainly appreciate that. Sharing is caring and is the way to my heart. Send me an email, paul.yeager@iowapbs.org. Now let's get to our discussion. Michael, what's the most rewarding part of your job there at Purdue?
Certainly the most rewarding part at the current time is working on the AG Economy Barometer. Part of that is because it takes quite a bit of my time. Because it's a monthly survey, we have to develop the survey, and then we have to go ahead and summarize the survey, and then we develop the report. And then it comes out the first Tuesday of every month, and so we have quite a few interviews, that week that it comes out, and so it takes up quite a bit of my time, but it's a very enjoyable activity because you get the combination of talking to people about the report, and as part of those conversations, I usually bring up what's going on in production agriculture, in terms of net farm income and other agriculture finance topics. That's my primary area, but it also gives us a chance to get a monthly report that's fresh, that contains fresh information. So there's just a lot of reasons why it's my favorite activity.
I totally jumped the gun into the activity because what set you up to do this job? What's your background? What's your background?
Oh, in terms of my background, I grew up on a farm in Nebraska, about 60 miles northwest of Omaha. And then when you grow up in Nebraska in rural areas, it's just natural to migrate towards the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. So I went to the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and got a bachelor's degree in agriculture economics. I enjoyed myself, and so I stayed on for a master's degree there. And then I was still enjoying myself as a graduate student. And the job market was a little tight at that time, but I'm an academic at heart. I just love academics, not only the learning portion, but the reading portion, the writing portion, and so I stayed in school and got a PhD at Purdue and graduated from Purdue in 1990. And then I was lucky enough the job market was tight again for graduate students in 1990, but I was lucky enough to land a primarily an outreach job in agriculture economics at Kansas State University. I was there from 1990 to 2012, and then I had an opportunity to move back to Purdue and work for the Center for Commercial Agriculture in 2012, and so went ahead and took that. And then this project here, the AG Economy Barometer, we were approached in mid 2015 by the CME Group. And they were looking for somebody to develop a producer sentiment index that was similar similar to the Consumer Sentiment Index at the University of Michigan. Only this would be strictly for agriculture producers in the United States, and so we developed a proposal for the CME group, and we were one of three universities. I don't know who the other two were, but I know we had some competition, and we were lucky enough to land the project, and we haven't looked back.
When you say sentiment, I'm going to get into that because that is a big part of when I read yours that is always a question for me. So I'm going to tease the sentiment part.
Sentiment's not the same as facts on the ground.
Right.
That was one of the things that we found out very early on. In fact, when we started this project, one of my colleagues here, one of my colleagues in the department said, "Well, this is going to be kind of uninteresting because it's going to follow corn prices," and it does. To some extent, obviously, if you have an increase in corn or soybean prices or wheat prices, those are the primary enterprises involved in the AG Economy Barometer. But there's also beef and swine and dairy and cotton producers involved in answering the survey. But it does follow those prices somewhat. But there's a lot of other things going on, and so it's sentiment. It's not corn price. You're not asking them about their opinion about the corn price in December 2026. You're asking them, their thoughts. And so, for example, you'll have questions such as, do you think production agriculture can have good times or bad times in the next 5 years? And so it's subjective. It's more subjective than objective.
So do you find problems or challenges with that definition versus the scientific when it's more of an opinion than a number?
I don't. As a social science, I've always thought that there's more to our science than just profit maximization and facts on the ground. And so a big part of economics is expectations. Expectations drive land values, for example. You're buying an asset that's going to last. You're going to have for decades. You're going to hold for decades. And so it's not so much what the return is in a given year or the last 3 years. You're really thinking about what's going to be my return for the next 30 plus years. That's the way this producer survey really takes place. Is you're asking people about their thoughts, kind of what agriculture is going to look like in the next 5 years, but also what it looks like today. And so it doesn't bother me that it's more subjective, more sentiment based than dealing with prices. Having said that, I also give quite a few presentations on outlook and other topics that are based on fundamentals. But fundamentals are important to sentiment, but it's certainly not the only thing. And things like geopolitical shocks to the system matter. Like when the war in Ukraine started, that made a difference to sentiment. Things like trade. If trade looks like it's slowing up or slowing down or speeding up, that's incorporated into sentiment. It's incorporated in prices too, but it's certainly incorporated in sentiment. And so in addition to the fundamentals, there's shocks. Another thing that we saw very clearly that is elections matter. There was pretty big movements in the sentiment index in 2016, 2020, and 2024, with the biggest movements occurring in 2016 and 2024.
And does that because it ties to who won?
Yes.
Because it looks
like the way to think about that is I call that when I talk to the press, I call that the long run policy environment, for a lack of a better way of putting it. They're not just looking at the current policies. They're thinking about, well, probably with this new administration, tax policy is going to change, monetary policy is going to change, and environmental policy is going to change. And so, if that looks more amenable to production agriculture with the person that was elected, that's going to improve sentiment, and vice versa.
Well, because sometimes it looks like, oh, it's somebody from that party. I look at agriculture more optimistically. And that's where sometimes there could be some questions about, well, what's that really telling me? That's just an extension of someone's political beliefs, not necessarily an extension of their financial or farm beliefs.
The way I would counter that is the sentiment's not static with regard to that long run policy environment. You take the 2024 national election as an example. Sentiment went up substantially in November, December 24, but it didn't stay at those levels. And so if there's any slippage in terms of what they think the policy environment's going to look like, as we got into issues related to tariffs and trade issues like that, sentiment's impacted. And so yes, there's certainly some sentiment driven by who's in office. I'm not going to say that's not important, but there's also if the environment looks different, even with that same person in office, if the environment looks different, the sentiment slips, either improves or deteriorates a little bit. And one of the reasons why I think that the sentiment's lower right now than it was a year ago is the long run policy environment doesn't look quite as positive. The some of the uncertainty related to trade is still with us, and then recently, of course, the large increases in nitrogen and diesel prices, those things matter, and so that attitude towards policy is not static.
Where is we use your survey in the program, but we also use Creighton University and their business conditions and their Main Street Index. I know that Ernie Goss does, like a 10-state region for the majority of your questionnaires. What are
Yeah.
your major states? Or how many states, I should say?
Our survey is U.S. based, and when we developed it in 2015, we wanted to reflect value added in U.S. agriculture. But however, we did leave some enterprises out because we didn't think we had the knowledge to really address those enterprises. And so vegetables, tree nuts, fruits. Those would certainly be left out of the producers that we survey, and so it's corn, soybean, wheat, cotton at the U.S. level, then beef, swine, and dairy at the U.S. level, and two-thirds of the producers are corn, soybean, and wheat. But having said that, if we asked a question in this last month's survey to just the people that produce corn in 2025. That was close to 80% of the people. And so when I say that two-thirds of them grow corn, soybean, and wheat, that means that's their predominant enterprise. We've got a lot of diversified farms in this country still. Not as many as there used to be, but there's still a lot of diversified farms, particularly in the western, what I call the western Corn Belt, or Kansas, Nebraska, Dakotas. There's still a lot of farms out there that have a lot of different enterprises, including cow calf or some kind of livestock enterprise in addition to the crops. And so it's really covering both specialized operations that have those enterprises, and along with diversified operations that have those enterprises.
And is it the same people each month?
No, that's something that's very important to note. No, we try to keep the demographics the same. And so we're trying to survey full-time farms, and so we try to survey those that have a gross farm income above 500,000, which isn't very large at today's standards, but it does ensure that most of the people that we survey are full-time operators. And then we also try to keep the enterprise mix the same. So we're shooting for like two-thirds corn, soybean, and wheat, and we want to make sure that that's similar every month. So the demographics, the characteristics of the farms are the same, but it's not the same people. In fact, there's a couple of people have told me that they've actually got calls and answered the survey. In the last 10 years, there probably is very few people that have even been called twice.
That's amazing to think that doing it as long as you have, 11 years, and you're not usually getting somebody called twice. And it just shows that there are a lot of farmers out there.
Yeah, there's a lot of farmers out there that meet our characteristics. And in fact, if you looked at the USDA ERS numbers, it would be 10% or more of all the farms in the U.S. And so you're dealing with 200 to 250,000 potential farms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, but here's the thing, though. There's this question that comes up about data. last year we have these, we have the analysts come on the show and they talk to farmers and they're like, we don't believe what USDA is putting out because that's not A, backyarditis. We always have that. I mean, that always happens. But B, well, I know so-and-so that was called, they didn't turn their survey in. Ha, they'll show the government. Tell me why it's important to respond when somebody asks you a question about what's going on.
Well, one of the things that we do, and I think I like to think this gives us a little bit of a leg up. When we call, we say that it's such and such from Purdue University, and so we're not calling from the USDA NAS or something like that. And so I think that helps a little bit. That I think people are more likely to answer a question from a university, somebody from a university, than someone from the federal government. That's kind of my guess a little bit. But having said that, we still have quite a few people that don't answer the phone or hang up on us, and that's a problem with these types of surveys. But we've really struggled thinking about a way that we could do this differently, because I always worry about what's going to happen when people don't answer the phone, when there's more and more people that don't answer the phone because they look at the numbers and say, well, I don't recognize that number, I'm not going to answer that phone. And then a lot of people do that. And so we've thought about how else we could do this survey, and there is no plan B at this time. A lot of my colleagues use Qualtrics, but the problem with that is we really want to reach 400 people every single month. And if you do an online survey, first of all, you don't have near as much control of who's answering the survey. That's a big problem. But you also, if a month like April and May, when people in the field, you're going to have a fraction of the people return it compared to what there's going to be in February. And so there's no easy way to do this. But what we've done has worked pretty well so far.
And it's easier to say higher, lower, 7, 2, 5.
We keep the question
when you're in the field.
That's very, very important.
Than it is to pick up a device.
We kind of discussed that back and forth a little bit, and I was pretty insistent, but so were my colleagues, that we keep these questions very simple: higher, lower, same. And sometimes we'll have questions that have 5 choices or so. Those are a little difficult to answer, but we still try to keep those very simple. Like one of the examples of that is we ask a question related to what is your biggest concern. We've got input costs, prices, input availability, interest rates, and a couple other things in there. So it's a little longer question, but we keep the buckets really simple. That's really, really important. And if you answer online surveys, the danger there is they want to make them really complicated. For example, they'll say, well, I have a bucket of concerns. I'm going to rank those. We never do that kind of stuff because it's just too difficult it's too difficult the way we're trying to do this survey for people to do that on the phone.
And when someone responds, do you know geographic general area? Or do you know exactly?
But our internal review board at Purdue makes sure that we don't see it.
Okay, well, because that's what I was going to ask.
Yeah, we have a firm in Kansas City that does the calls for us, and so we never get that information as part of what we get from the firm on purpose.
So an outside firm is the one who does the phone calling, but they say that they are.
They know the name, Purdue. Obviously. They know where they're from, and I've been asked that question a lot from researchers, and the short answer is no. But even if we did, when you have a sample of 400 and they're all over the country, it would be very difficult to say anything statistically about the person in Nebraska. The people in Nebraska this month answered differently than people in Indiana.
Well, that's where I'm going. Yes, absolutely. Because I want to know, are you getting a geographic difference in the way people view things? That's really what I'm going for.
We don't have a big enough sample to really capture that. I wish the only thing we could do, but it's just not part of our our operating agreement that we have here with the university. What would be interesting to me is the Corn Belt different? Mm-hmm. That's what would be interesting to me. Did people in the Corn Belt states answer the question differently than the people out west or the people in the southern part of the country? And I can't tell you that. The only time we separate the producers is we can separate the producers into primary livestock, primarily crop. And when we do that, we don't do that every month, but when we do that, there's about a third of the survey gets more than 50% of their revenue from beef or from
Sure.
livestock, beef being the largest one by far. The other 2/3 are primarily crop producers. And so I've done quite a few short articles for Farm Doc and for the Center for Commercial Agriculture website, looking at sentiment differences between crop and livestock. But that's about as far as we will go in terms of looking at subsets of the data.
Well, okay, I know you can't quite do super subsets, but let's talk about the beef producer versus the crop producer right now. What's the difference between them in the way they're feeling about
Oh, the
things? Can
sentiment
you tell
for
that?
livestock is through the roof compared to crop. For example, one of the questions we ask: do you think we'll have good times or bad times in the next 5 years? For the livestock, that's 70% say good times. For crop, it's closer to 30. So extremely wide differences in their sentiment, particularly for short term and long term, really, but primarily short term. A tremendous difference in sentiment right now. We've seen it reverse too. I mean, there was times when the livestock sector wasn't doing it as well during this time period, but right now it's probably the biggest gap. Well, it's definitely the biggest gap we've seen since we started 10 years ago.
I keep hearing from certain people who study markets, not necessarily the fundamental side, but the technical side, and then they peek over at the fundamental side, that they think we might just be getting on this cattle cycle. And that just, oof, you think the sentiment's high or low now? Wait till that data gets into the mainstream.
Yeah, it's a really tough environment. I mean, obviously the heifers are worth a fortune, and so to make that decision that you're going to keep that heifer back, and is very expensive decision, and you don't know how long this is going to last, and so you're not. It's like land. You're not making this decision for the next year. You're making this decision for the next several years, and so it's a very tough decision, and then you tack onto that the fact that we still have a lot of drought in a lot of the cow calf areas, and it's just very difficult to increase the size of the herd. And I have a colleague here that's from Brazil, and the prices aren't quite as strong down there, but they also have had a big run up in prices in the last year or two, because one of the things that's happening in Brazil is they just keep taking some of that marginal pasture ground and putting soybeans on it. Well, that's makes their beef herd difficult to increase, and when their global demand is high, and so this beef we're not going to get out of this anytime soon.
Yeah, that is one thing I think we are hearing in an agreement upon. All right, let's look at issues then that you have seen change over the last 2 to 4 years compared to the last year. Is there anything? I mean, you mentioned the inputs, the diesel and the fertilizer, and that's an obvious discussion point. But when you mention Brazil, that's a competitor. China, a competitor, but also a buyer. Where is the farmer right now in how they're responding? How has that changed in the last 6 to 12 months versus the last 5 years?
The trade is partially the trade and tariffs are certainly partially responsible for the sentiment going from pretty high levels in late 2024 to something lower than that. There was a lot of concerns about trade and tariffs, and so that's certainly the case. When you talk about Brazil, we added a question a few months back. We did it 2 months in a row. Are you concerned about the competitiveness of U.S. soybeans compared to Brazil? 70% said they were concerned or very concerned. And so obviously that's on people's radar, and really. I don't know if we picked this up in the sentiment index too much, but I think we might have a little bit in some of the comments. When we look at the 1819 trade woes with China, and then we look at today, it's really different because Brazil has increased production dramatically since 18. That they were closer to being able to provide all the soybeans to China a lot more today compared to what they were even in 1819, and so I think that added to some of the concerns about the trade and tariffs. That if we lose this market, are we going to get it back? And so I certainly think that was part of it. But one of the things that's really impacting the sentiment, this is not the last 6 or 12 months. This goes back to COVID. is the input costs. The biggest concern has been high input costs ever since COVID. That has not changed, and there's nothing even a close second. It's been over 40% since COVID. It was 46% in the last 2 months, which is really high, obviously, for obvious reasons. But it hasn't been below 40% since COVID started. And prices, even though prices aren't very good, particularly for crop producers, that's ranged from 25 to 35. And so it's a very distant second in terms of concerns. And so that's a little unusual. In my career, most of the time, if you ask somebody what's their concern, well, the prices are low. It's not necessarily this high input cost, and so this world's just changed our cost structures, because of COVID.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think of all the episodes I've done of this podcast and in the TV show talking about the logistics and the supply chain challenges, and that's just cross that out on your survey and now write in inputs. And again, it's still always there. So I'll ask, in your questions, are you putting inquiries about the future?
Oh yeah, when the AG Economy Barometer is 5 questions, and 3 of the questions are future oriented.
Okay. How future oriented?
Looking 5 years out.
Okay, that's right. You did say that often.
Yeah, and then also we have a land value question. We have 2 land value questions. One is land values in the next 12 months. We've been asking that since January 2019. We didn't do that question in the start. I wish we would have, but you learn as you continue to do surveys, and we learned that was a good question. But we have a land value questions the next 12 months, and then we have a land value question that's 5 years. And some of our other questions are also 5 years. Sometimes we'll ask questions like I think I'm going to add to this next month or the month after. Do you think the ethanol industry will expand in the next 5 years? Do you think renewable diesel markets will be stronger 5 years from now? And so quite often we'll ask real long-term questions like that because I want to get at that long-run policy environment. Is there anything changing? What I think things are going to look like 5 years from now, and then I can relate those questions back to the actual AG Economy Barometer index.
And again, how many questions each month?
It varies a little bit. It's usually 25 to 30. Okay. There's 20 questions that are 20 questions that have been the same for quite a few months now. It goes back probably even 2-3 years now. And then we have some extra questions that are more specific to policies that are occurring. For example, the last month we asked, do you think the Iran conflict, what impact do you think the Iran conflict is going to have on your net farm income in 2026? So we look at timely things like that, in addition to the 20 questions that are kind of the core.
And I will also notice that you will put in your report or your press release usually the week or days that you took it, because certain things can change right after or right before you make those phone calls.
Yes, that's so make sure when we're talking to people or when people are looking at this report that they understand that if something occurred, we might have called people before that happened, and this happened recently. We did a survey. We did the survey in mid-February, and then the Iran conflict didn't heat up for another couple of weeks. And so it really didn't have much impact on the February survey. It had some impact on the March survey, but its full impact really, I don't think the full impact was really noticed until April, because it's just a timing issue.
What's the future of the survey?
Hopefully, the future CME Group continues to enjoy what we're doing. We have a 2-year rolling contract on this. And so we negotiate proposals 2 years at a time, and this current project is funded through December 26th, and so hopefully we'll have two or more years, 2 or more year extension this December.
And do you have alums that have gone on, whether they were grad students that helped, that maybe have gone on to other surveys and called you back? Hey, tell me exactly what it is that you did to help in their next job.
We're probably seeing it more on the research side. I mean, now that we have enough data, there's quite a bit of interest by researchers here and researchers that were perhaps graduate students while the survey was taking place. And so I see that quite often. And we've got a couple relatively new faculty members that are really trying to dig into the survey and try to relate the AG Economy Barometer to what's going on in the rest of the world. Like, is it related to uncertainty indexes? Is it related to changes in corn prices? Is it related to changes in monetary policy? And that's a work in progress. But obviously, that's very interesting to me because that would help me explain. Why did the survey move this month? Well, if the biggest factors are interest rates, corn prices, and something else, I can say, well, these things changed. These things changed. I always do that with corn prices. I always look at what corn and soybean prices did from the previous survey to today's survey to see if that made any difference. And a lot of times it obviously did make a difference. But I go back to that. There's other things that happened. This Iran conflict's a classic example that moved the needle.
Well, okay. I'm just going to ask you a couple of historical things to finish up here. So you started in 2015. What's been the highest time period? And then what's been the lowest rating in these 11 years?
The highest was after the 2016 election. After the 2016 election was the top. It got close to that in 21, 22, when we had really strong prices and the input costs hadn't increased yet. There was about a year there, I think it was 21, where crop prices increased and input costs were still relatively low and profits were really high. That was also a very high period. So those are the two highs. Probably the lowest was at the first 6 months were pretty low. 2015, 2016 was not a great time in terms of agriculture. And so,
well, yeah, I mean,
and so the indices were pretty low during that period. That's why most of the time the index is above 100 because the first 6 months are the base period of 100. And there's only been a few times where it's dropped below 100. One of those times was April 2020, right at the beginning of COVID. I have never seen producers so down, so negative, and that's anecdotal evidence. Talking to producers, you had meetings on the phone, and it showed in the sentiment clearly that they were really worried. And another thing I didn't talk about as much as I probably should. Uncertainty really matters, and so if it looks like the world is really fuzzy and uncertain, sentiment plummets. And that at that time, nobody knew how this was going to move forward, what was going to happen to prices, what was going to happen to input costs, what was going to happen to crop prices. And so all that uncertainty really took that index down.
You sound like you've been hearing some of our people talk on our show because they say some of that same thing. Producers want certainty. Whatever the policy is, set it, forget it, move on. We'll adjust it as needed. But this whole up and down, in and out, yes, no business is super hard to plan.
And it comes in two fashions. One is the switch of the administrations are so big. The difference in the policy environment is so big from one administration to the next. That's so hard to plan when you see that big of changes from one administration to the next. So that's part of it. And I think the Farm Bill used to be a better buffer than perhaps it is today to try to smooth that out a little bit. But for whatever reason, that seems to be really bumpy today. And I've been doing this for a while. And so it seems like that's more extreme today. But also, of course, when the administration's hard to read and they change their mind, that also causes uncertainty because you thought, well, I thought I knew where this was heading, and then now I don't really know where this is heading, and so that also impacts it.
I also like to use the word indigestion too, uncertainty, because it does cause some consternation if you want to go to another word.
Yes, definitely.
All right, Michael, I appreciate the insight. I always look forward to seeing the first week of the month when the release comes out and to see what happened in rural America from your viewpoint. Thank you, Michael.
You bet. Take care.
We are produced at Iowa PBS. Our production supervisor is Sean Ingracia. His crew is Reed Denker, Kevin Rivers, Julie Knudsen, Neil Kyer, and David Feingold. The executive producer of Market to Market is David Miller. I'm Paul Yeager. We'll see you next time.